Hello and welcome to the first ever London Library online event. You will have just seen a bit of a video which will tell you that the London Library is a treasure trove of information and discovery, a literary oasis in central London which is serving members even now. It's not working. Is this working? Someone tell me if it's working. Thank you. We're serving members even now while we're closed with our postal service and amazing online resources. The library was founded in 1841. Charles Dickens was a founder member. Virginia Woolf was a life member. Stanley Kubrick researched his films at the library. Bram Stoker wrote Dracula with books we still have on our shelves. And we continue to offer inspiration to a wide and open community of writers, thinkers and readers today. We run a varied programme of events at the library, a number of which, including this event, we're very pleased to offer in partnership with Jewish Book Week, which is the annual international festival of literature, culture and ideas, which takes place in the first week of March. So it might have been the very last thing you attended before lockdown. My name is Claire Berliner. I'm the Events and Programme Manager at the library, and I'm delighted to be joined by Philippe Sands. Philippe is Professor of Law at University College London, a practising barrister who frequently appears before international courts, including the International Criminal Court and the World Court in The Hague. And as if that wasn't enough, he is the best-selling author of the wonderful East-West Street and now its follow-up, The Ratline, which is just published, or publishes tomorrow, and is already in receipt of glowing reviews and it's an incredibly compelling, fascinating and often shocking story. I'm going to hand over to Philippe now to tell you more about it, and then we'll open to questions. Please use the chat function. I think some of you are already using it, which is next to our face. And you can start asking questions as soon as you like, and we'll endeavour to cover as many as we can before our 45 minutes is up. Philippe, many of us will have read East-West Street. In The Ratline, you've picked a thread from that book and you've followed it into quite surprising and revelatory territory. Could you tell us about the book and the journey you took, literally and metaphorically, from East-West Street to The Ratline?
Sure. Thank you. Well, firstly, thank you, Claire, for inviting me. Thank you to the London Library and Jewish Book Week, and thank you to everyone who's out there. I'm so sorry that I can't see you. I'm so sorry that I can't be with you in person. It's been a long journey, and I was hugely looking forward to this event with two organisations that I esteem greatly. The Ratline is a very different book in a sense from East-West Street, but it does bear certain similarities, and it is a sequel of sorts. Those of you who've read East-West Street will have identified or recall one minor character, important, but minor, very important in my family's life. His name was Otto Vector. He was the governor of Krakow and then of District Galicia, based in Lemberg. And he oversaw the extermination of hundreds of thousands of human beings, Jews and Poles, in Lemberg and District Galicia. And amongst those people were my grandfather's entire family. So he has a very personal connection. He played a small role in East-West Street. He was the deputy of Hans Frank, who was one of the four characters in East-West Street. As I was writing East-West Street, I became increasingly interested in the character of Otto Vector. And at a certain moment, I asked Hans Frank's son Nicholas a few questions about Vector. And he said to me, "You're interested in Vector. Would you be interested in meeting the son?" And I said, "I would be interested in meeting him." And he said to me, "Well, he's different from me. I hate my father and he loves his father. Or he has a positive feeling towards his father, but let's see what we can do." Anyway, one thing led to another. We met in early 2012. Horst is a genial and warm person. He was in his late 70s then. He was born in 1939, the same year as Nicholas. We met. I went back a year later. I wrote a profile for the Financial Times. That profile was picked up by a friend of mine who's a film director, David Evans. And he made a documentary, which some of you will have seen, My Nazi Legacy, which is about my relationship with Nicholas and Horst at that point. We filmed it in 2014. The film came out in 2015, and at some point in the film, some of you will have seen it, you'll remember, Nicholas describes Horst as a new Nazi. I don't think Horst is a Nazi, but Nicholas retracts that in due course. But Horst saw that moment in the film. He saw the film, and he was offended, and he said, "I'm not a Nazi. What can I do to prove that I'm not a Nazi?" And I said, "Well, you've got this huge archive, your mother's archive, her letters, her diaries, her photographs, her recordings, her reminiscences. Why don't you give the whole thing to a museum? And then scholars and researchers and other people can pore through it and form their own view about your parents." He said, "That's a great idea. Who should I give it to?" I said, "Well, I think the museum that would digitize it best and look after it very well would be the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. He said, "Fine, I'll do it." And he did it. And within a few weeks, the folks from the Holocaust Museum had come and had digitized and gathered all the material. And at that point, Horst said to me, "Would you like all of the material?" And we're talking here about around 10,000 pages. The entire letters of Otto and Charlotte Vector, his parents, their diaries, their ramblings, their reminiscences, their recordings, their other bits and pieces. And he sent me a single USB stick with all the material on it, and I started going through it, and prompted by the wonderful late historian Lisa. But on the 9th of May 1945, he disappeared off the face of the earth, and he did not reappear for another 4.5 years. And he reappeared in July 1949 in Rome, in Italy, in a Vatican-run hospital, dead. He had died in mysterious circumstances. And the book, The Ratline, is essentially about the story of what happened to Otto Vector after he escaped in 1945, and how he tried to get to Argentina on the thing that is known as the Ratline. So that, in a nutshell, is what the story is about.
So the library obviously is a place where people come to conduct research, and research and libraries play a really pivotal role in this story. And you've talked about everything that you got from Horst, but how did you go about finding everything else? You had multiple mysteries to uncover, you had unusual relationships to navigate, and you had to also make sense of people's unreliable and often fragile memories and perspectives. Could you just tell us a little bit about that process?
Right. Sure. So in a nutshell, what did I want to know? There were a number of different things that I wanted to know. I wanted to know who Otto Vector was and what exactly he had done. I wanted to know what he did as a young man, as a law student. I want to know what caused him to join the Nazi Party as early as 1923. I want to know the kind of law that he practiced. I wanted to know why he got involved in the killing of Chancellor Dollfuss in Austria in 1934, why he fled to Berlin. And when he came back, I wanted to know what he did as a high political appointment in Vienna, in Krakow, in Lemberg. So there was that whole side of the story, the sort of professional activities. Otto Vector as a mass murderer, Otto Vector as a lawyer. But there was a second story I was fascinated about, and I think this is what was really unique about the material that I was privileged, and I'm very grateful to Horst, the son, for giving me access to it. I wanted to know about the love story. I wanted to know about a relationship between a man and a woman, Charlotte and Otto, who lived through this entire period. And I had access to everything, all of their letters, all of their diaries, and I could work that out. I wanted to know how it was possible for a couple to live through that period, from the moment they met in 1929 in a railway carriage in Vienna's central station to the moment he died in 1949, 20 years later. And because of the letters, because of the assistance of some remarkable researchers, James Everest, Leomine Klinkst, and various other people, we went through all of the letters, all of the diaries. We translated everything, we transcribed everything, we interpreted everything. And I wanted to know how a Nazi wife supported her husband. I wanted to know how a man could be involved in acts of mass murder whilst at the same time the wife is attending the Salzburg festival and going to performances of Bruckner's Seventh Symphony and the Marriage of Figaro. How could people have this double life, and what was her role in enabling? How did she perform as a wife and as a mother, because they were both parents? That I was interested in also. And of course, then there is the third part of the story that I'm fascinated about. What happened to him after the war ended? When the war comes to an end on the 9th of May 1945, Otto Vector disappears off the face of the earth. How did he escape? Where did he go? Who helped him? And that is, in a sense, there are many shocking aspects of these stories, but that is the most shocking aspect of the story. He disappears for 3 years in Austria, not so far from Charlotte. She helps him. He goes very high. He lives high in the mountains, above 2,000 meters. And then in late 1948, he comes down from the mountains and decides to make his way across the Dolomites into Italy, down to Rome, where he will be helped. And there the mystery begins. And at this point, we get to the sort of library type of archival research. We have, for example, Otto Vector's diary from 1949, his letters and his private notes. But the letters and diaries are all encoded. So every person he meets has a false name. He is met early on in Rome on his first day by a person he refers to as the religious gentleman. Who is the religious gentleman? He is helped by a friend called Giovanni, or is he called Bauer, or is he called G, or is he called Gruesome 237? It's the same person with lots of different names. Who is this person? So to explain how we get about the research, what happens right at the end of Vector's life is he goes and spends a weekend at Lake Albano by Castel Gandolfo. And he, there in Castel Gandolfo, meets with an old comrade who is married to an Italian who has a 4-week-old daughter. But he does not name the comrade. We knew by then that whenever he referred to old comrade, he is referring to someone who was an SS officer, a senior SS officer. But we didn't have the actual name. How did we track down the name? We started by looking into the local records in that part of Italy, looking for people, a German married to an Italian with a young child. We narrowed it down and we were able to identify with absolute precision who that person was. We then double-checked it by going into the archives and the libraries of the CIA and the US Federal Archives in the United States, and were able to identify that this particular German SS officer was in fact an agent for the Americans and for the British, working closely with elements in the Vatican. And from there, the rest of the story unfolded. The simple point is that armed with a single letter, 4th of July 1949, and a reference to an old comrade married to an Italian with a 4-week-old child, it is possible to uncover the totality of the story of the Ratline in relation to Otto Vector. And that was exciting. It was very time-consuming. It was very meticulous work, but it meant, assisted by some fantastic librarians and archivists all over the world, we were able to ascertain with absolute precision the shocking story that is the Ratline.
So you went through this process of research, and it was a similar process of research as you went through with East West Street. So you could, so it involved sometimes just finding a tiny piece of evidence, and you going through this whole trail to find out, what was at the basis of it, or someone's photo and you didn't even know who it was, and that whole process. How has it affected your understanding of your family, your understanding of the history, and also what about Horst? How did it affect his understanding of his history?
Yeah, I think the bigger issue is the relationship with Horst. I mean, I've described in the book a relationship that's now lasted 10 years. You know, it has ebbs and flows. It starts with that meeting in early 2012. There's then a follow-up meeting a year later. And then we've seen each other once or twice a year. Every year we've been to Lviv, we've been to Rome, we've traveled around. And it's a very complex relationship. He is the son of a Nazi mass murderer and a mother and a wife who totally supported her husband. In 10,000 pages of family archives, there is not a single expression of regret about what her husband did in the case of Charlotta. In the case of Otto, there is no hint of regret after the war, of any excesses, of mistakes made, of having gone too far. And that is deeply troubling. Going back to what I said right at the outset, you know, that my own grandfather was very directly implicated in the actions and the crimes of Otto Vector. This is very personal. But of course, Horst is not responsible for the actions of his father and for the support of his mother. What interests me is Horst's engagement with those facts. And it's a complicated story. On the one hand, Horst recognizes that his father was deeply involved in heinous international crimes. But, and this is the big but, Horst will not accept that his father himself was a criminal. He, as he puts it, looks for the good in his father, looking to identify reasons that explain why his father tried to do the right thing in difficult circumstances. And he'll take refuge in points of detail: the absence of a smoking gun, the absence of a piece of paper signed by Otto Vector which says, "I order the killing of 10,000 Jews." No, there aren't pieces of paper that say that. But there are pieces of paper which say, "I order the expulsion of 3,500 Jews from Lemberg in early 1942. What did that mean? It meant they were sent to a place called Belzec, where they were exterminated. Or there is a document in which Otto Vector orders the construction of the Krakow ghetto. So there is a mass of material which is, I think, absolutely conclusive in showing his direct involvement. But it is Horst's relationship to this that I find so complex. And you have to put Horst in his family context. He is one of 6 children. And to give Horst credit, he's the only child who's really engaged with these issues. Although he comes to an interpretation of the facts that are very different from mine, at least he has engaged with the facts. And to give him further credit, he has been totally transparent. Every time I ask for a document or ask for a fact or ask for an explanation, he always accedes to my request. He always gives me what I'm looking for, or tries to find it, or tries to help me get hold of it by other means. So how do we explain Horst? And here I'm really getting to your question. Early on in the relationship, in 2014-2015, as I mentioned, we made a film together, a BBC Storyville film. And very early in that film, for those of you who have seen it, you may recall there's a moment where I'm talking with Horst about his birthday party in 1945 in April. He's 6 years old, and he describes the imminent end of the war, which he remembers well, and he describes the collapse of his childhood life, the collapse of his parents being together, the end of family life as he knew it, and he begins to weep. It's one of the few times that Horst weeps. And that moment touched me very greatly, because in that moment I came to understand that Horst too was a victim of the terrible circumstances, the terrible facts of that time. And that I think, as psychoanalysts and psychiatrists have explained to me, he has probably spent the rest of his life trying to preserve the positive elements of what happened up to that point in order to make life livable and life worth living. In other words, he's constructed a narrative for himself which enables him to get up in the morning. It's a different narrative from Nicholas Frank. Nicholas Frank has taken a different path. He hates his father. He says his father deserved the death penalty, and that's how he gets by. But different people cope in different ways. And in coming to know Horst, I've come to understand for the first time, to a certain extent, but of course not completely, what it means to grow up with a father who was a mass murderer. it's unimaginable. I talked about it a lot also with Nicholas Frank, whose father was hanged at Nuremberg for killing 4 million human beings, 3 million Jews and 1 million Poles. And I can't even begin to imagine what it's like to live with that on a daily basis. I lived on the other side of the story, if you like, the victim side of the story. And in this curious way, I find myself bonded with Horst. Of course, we have different perspectives, but it is in that way you pick up a degree of empathy on my part, not because I support his interpretations of what his father did, but because I understand he went through a significant trauma that has affected him and the entirety of his family for the rest of his life.
And what about his relationship to Charlotta? Because is that more or less complicated than his relationship to his father? Well, we were saying earlier she was an enabler.
Charlotta was an enabler. I mean, Charlotta was an extraordinary person. She was 8 years younger than her husband. She was born in 1908. She came from a very wealthy industrial family. Her father was a steel magnate, the Bleckmann steel mill in Mürzuschlag. So she was very well-to-do, nevertheless imbued from a very early age with anti-Semitism, a rebellious child, a rebellious human being, a distinct character. She comes and lives in England for a year. In 1925, she's parked at a girls' boarding school in Eastbourne and develops a great love for Britain and all things British and English. Curiously, she believes, and it's ironic given where we are now, that the British are more nationalistic than the Germans and the Austrians. And this comes out in some of her correspondence. She meets Otto in 1929. They court for 3 years. She falls pregnant. They marry. They have, in the end, 6 children, and she is a dutiful wife, but she has also foregone a career as an artist. She's a designer of fabrics. She studied with Joseph Hoffmann of the Wiener Werkstätte, and so she's a cultured person to a certain extent. She's an intelligent person to a certain extent. She's not an intellectual, but she's smart, she's savvy, and she cares about her family. And I'm fascinated about the wife side of it. There is a moment in 1938. Otto has fled Germany Austria in 1934 because he's been involved in the killing of Chancellor Dollfuss. And he comes back triumphant in March 1938, and the two of them stand on the balcony of the Hofburg in the Heldenplatz to welcome, if you like, the Nazi Anschluss, the Nazi conquest of Austria. And Charlotta describes in her memoirs, in her diaries, her reminiscences, standing 1 meter from Adolf Hitler and describing this as the greatest day of her life. What she then describes is after they left the balcony, they walked down, some of you will know there, you've been inside the museum, the vast marble staircase, huge. They get to the bottom, and Otto turns to Charlotta and says to her, "So, my darling, we have an option. I can carry on with my legal career, I can make a lot of money on the one hand, or I could accept the offer that Arthur Seyss-Inquart has given me to join the government and to become state commissioner in the new government. What should I do?" And she says, "Take the job. We don't care about the money. I'm interested in power." And that's essentially what it's about. And she enters a life of concerts and Burgtheaters and opera houses and the Salzburg Festival and Bayreuth with Hitler and Himmler, Nuremberg, the rallies. She has entered a world that is dreamlike for her, and she describes that from the inside without any embarrassment at any point. She's an absolutely true and total believer in the system. And what I wanted to know was how someone in her position enables a powerful husband. And she was undoubtedly an enabler. And as Horst's wife said to me on one of the visits that I made there, she was a Nazi until the day she died in 1985. She then passes her entire archive to Horst, and 30 years later, precisely, the archive passes to me, and that's what the Ratline is about. It's the story of that family. Interestingly, the Wächters are a very successful and significant family in Austria, a very decent family, and they have managed to whitewash Otto, or Otto has been whitewashed out of history. You won't read about him in most of the history books. He doesn't appear on the table of top Nazis, but he is a top Nazi. And I think what the work that I've done, the work that Horst has done, brings this all back to the fore, and I suspect that will cause certain conniptions in parts of Austria.
And how you're obviously coming to the story from a personal perspective, with a personal association to the story, and also a professional one. But you do strike this incredible balance throughout, which is kind of inside and outside. There is the emotional connection is clear, but you are also, you have perspective on it. How did you find that balance?
Well, I mean, I'm lucky in a number of senses. I'm a lucky person. I have a good life. I have a good family. I'm, in a solid sort of environment. What are the pieces of luck that I've had? Well, one may not be a piece of luck, but one, of course, was that I grew up in a family that was affected by this. On the other side, my mother, as those of you who've read East West Street will know, was a hidden child, and very much on the receiving end of all of this, which meant that I knew the facts and I knew what had happened. But I'm lucky also because I work as an academic and as a barrister in court, and particularly, well, it's a combination of the two, but particularly being a barrister in court, you really do learn to strip the emotion out of what you are arguing. You can believe passionately in the case that you're making, but the judges don't want to know about that. They're not interested in your own emotion. And in the writing style that I developed in East West Street, with the help of my wonderful editors in New York and in London, I consciously stripped the emotion, not the passion. I think it's there, but in a different way, not on my sleeve, but it's there. But I stripped the emotion out of the writing, and I learnt that it's very important not to impose on an intelligent reader your own emotions about things. Actually, the writer that I admire in this sense is an Austrian writer called Stefan Zweig, who writes in a very similar way, often about very painful things. Many people who are watching this now will have read his extraordinary book, The World of Yesterday, which is, of course, so relevant, again, sadly, for today. And he does a similar thing, and I think I picked it up, in a sense, from writers like him, to strip the emotion out. And that meant that I was able to stand with Horst in terrible places and talk about things. But, sometimes I did get emotional, and I didn't like that. There's a moment in the film, some of you who've seen it will remember it, where I lose my rag with Horst. I've finally, after years of looking for it, Horst has been telling me there's nothing to prove my father was a mass murderer, and finally I find in an obscure Polish archive the actual indictment for mass murder of killing more than 100,000 human beings of Otto Vector. I show this to Horst, and he reacts blankly, and he finds some way of sort of wiggling out of it, and I get really irritated with him, and I lose my rag. I get angry with him, and that moment happens to be captured on film. My friend David Evans is there with a camera and the cameraman and sound, and it's recorded, and it makes its way into the film My Nazi Legacy. And of course, I don't like that, because losing my emotion is not what I'm trained to do and not what I want to do. But it's a very important part of the story, because ultimately I'm not there only as a writer or as a researcher or as a lawyer, but I'm also a son and a grandson who has seen firsthand what the consequences of these stories are. So it's a very complex commingling of different elements in the writing of a book like this. But the crucial question is, the reader has to form her or his own view about the characters. And one of the things I love so much about East West Street, and I'm beginning to get the similar responses now in relation to the Ratline, is that people have different interpretations of these characters and of the facts. And that satisfies me, because it means I haven't told people what to think. People are smart, they read intelligently, they think themselves, and they work out their own perceptions of what's going on, what's important and what's not important.
And having got to know Horst and done that investigation into the human story at the centre of the Ratline, has it affected your practice as a barrister? Has it had any impact on how you see cases?
Well, I mean, I'm lucky. I've written a lot of books. I'm very proud of the books that I wrote for 25 years that sold 47 copies, and I would write them all again. You know, they trained me to do footnotes and to do research. And one of the things I did in East West Street, and I've done with the Ratline, I hope, is to be absolutely meticulous about accuracy, so that everything is established, everything is proven. So I've taken my legal and researching skills into writing a book like this, but hopefully in an accessible way, with the help of those who have read it and made comments and so on and so forth. But it's an interesting question. How does it work in reverse? I mean, it's meant that I've been able to be more picky about what I'll do. I don't need to do quite so much work. I love writing, and I do more and more writing, and I spend more and more time in libraries and archives. But I still am a lawyer. You know, I have one very good friend who's a writer, a dear friend. We were talking about him before, Hisham Mattar, and his wonderful wife, Diana Mattar, the wonderful photographer. And so pretty often I say to Hisham, oh, should I give up the law? You know, I love writing. It's been so satisfying. I love the research. And Hisham looks at me and he says, no, you mustn't. The law is what nourishes you. And he's right. As a lawyer in the world that I'm involved in, I come across the most incredible individuals and the most incredible stories, and I have to digest the material and then present it either in a court of law or in a law book or now in these kinds of books. So I've carried on lawyering. The juggling gets a little bit more difficult. But interestingly, I've discovered that my lawyer friends, the arbitrators, the litigators, the judges, are happy to have in their midst a lawyer who also writes and explains issues of law and justice, because the Ratline is also very much about justice, to an intelligent audience out there that becomes interested in legal issues. So it's a very interconnected set of relations and lives that I lead at the same time, I would say. It's a very good question you're asking.
And actually someone has asked a question. Jane has said, you are a human rights lawyer and a fantastic researcher author. Do you see a parallel in the marriage of Bashar Assad, his private behaviour and his public behaviours, which are totally at odds with the family man? His wife seems to have the same disconnect as Charlotta.
Well, some of you may have read an article that I wrote last weekend. You can find it online. It was a long article. It's a long read, a 3,000-word article about my feelings about Charlotta and Otto and Horst. And it doesn't reproduce material in the book. It's a different kind of story. And right at the end, I describe a moment last December. It's not about Bashar al-Assad, whom I have to say I have come to meet. And yes, I spent extensive time in a room with Bashar al-Assad, actually before the real horrors began, but nevertheless asking myself exactly these questions. But last December, I sat in the International Court of Justice. I was doing the case for an African country, the Gambia, against Myanmar, alleging genocide of the Rohingya community. Some of you will know that case. It was quite widely reported. And some of you will have been aware that the main person to appear on behalf of Myanmar, Burma as it was Aung San Suu Kyi, winner of the Nobel Prize. And she stood up and made the arguments for Myanmar against Gambia's claim that genocide had happened and why the court should not do what the Gambia wanted it to do. And I was watching her and I was thinking about Charlotta. I was asking myself the question, how could it be that Aung San Suu Kyi, someone who has been an icon, someone we admire, someone we revere, could take such a position? And of course, I think the answer, as with Horst, is that it relates to her relationship with her father, who was a military man who she loved very much and who died 2 years before Burma got independence and became Myanmar, and who is the founder of the Myanmar military. So I think the personal and the professional are profoundly interconnected. We know all of this. People who are watching this, the 510 participants who are on this webcast, understand what I'm saying. You can't separate out your personal life and your professional life. Everything is interconnected in some way, and each of us struggles in our own way to balance the different parts of our lives.
Sorry, I'm hoping that the room doesn't disappear as it's telling me it's going to. If it does, we'll set it up again. Okay, we have another question about whether you might pick up what's next. You picked up a thread from East West Street, and will you pick up the next thread, and will you pursue the kind of the Vatican connection?
No surprise that an audience comprising of Jewish Book Week and the London Library would have such excellent questions. The answer is yes. I'm not disclosing any secrets. It's a trilogy. There is a character who appears in the Ratline, who becomes a major character in the next book. I mean, in this one, we're taken quite far into the Vatican, and this will be a surprise, a shock, I think, for some people. But of course, Otto is trying to escape to South America. When he arrives in Rome on the 29th of April 1949, he is parked by the religious gentleman and Giovanni in a monastery called the Vigna Pia, the Pious Vine. And the monastery has a number of monk cells which he occupies, one of them. And the cell has just been vacated by another old comrade. That old comrade has left Rome that day for Syria. He lives in Syria for a year. He then moves to Bolivia. He then moves to Argentina, and then he ends up in Chile and becomes a businessman. This man's name is Walter Rauff, R-A-U-F-F. And Walter Rauff's claim to fame is that he is the inventor of the mobile gas chamber. He has managed to reconstitute himself and become a distinguished Chilean businessman. And then in 1973, Walter Rauff becomes an interrogator for the Pinochet regime. And he interrogates a writer called Leon Gomez, who 25 years later, in 1998, writes a witness statement which becomes part of a series of statements sent to a prosecutor in Spain, Balthazar Garzon, which then lands on my desk and leads to the arrest of Senator Pinochet, who is in London. Some of you will remember that story. And so the next part of the story, unbelievably, is the Pinochet story and how that connects to East West Street and the Ratline. It's all seamless, it's all interconnected, and it all ties directly into the life of my grandfather, also in ways that I will explain in that book. But people will have to wait another 4 years or so for that book, I'm afraid. But yes, there is another one.
Wow, sounds amazing. Someone else has asked if Horst's position is one of moral neutrality or a refusal to see his father as a mass murderer, then what cause did he think he was serving in relinquishing all the archival material of his parents?
These are wonderful questions. So here is the challenge for me. I like Horst, but I don't like some of his interpretations of the facts. And the question that I ask myself is, at what point does being blind about the facts, in effect, make you complicit in crimes that have occurred in the past? In other words, justifying certain things. I don't think Horst is a justifier, and that's why I'm able to continue to have a good and decent and honest relationship with him. And one of the things that's marked our relationship is mutual respect. I say everything I think to him. He says things I don't like, I tell him. I say things he doesn't like, he tells me. And we're like sort of two waltzers, Austrian waltzers in a dance where I'm pulling him in one direction, he's pulling me in another direction, and neither manages ultimately to persuade the other. I think in giving the material to the Holocaust Museum, which is a supreme act of generosity or madness, depending on your perspective, he's done us all a great service because we're able to now see this material and form our own view. And I think he was hoping to persuade me with this material that his father was indeed a fine and decent man, enabled by a fine and decent wife. I don't think the material reveals that. But, and I don't want to give away too much here, there are plenty of twists and turns in this book, and there are surprises at the end. When you are given, I mean, you'll know this working with archives and libraries, 10,000 pages is a lot of pages. And your eye is drawn to certain things and you miss certain other things. Very late in the day, I found buried in the material a more recent document, which was very revealing on the question of Horst's motivations and Horst's views earlier in time. I don't want to give away too much, but I think that he believed by giving me this material, he could persuade me, and he will now be reading the book and working out whether that was a wise thing to do or not.
Well, a good question here. Do you think the difference between Horst and Nicholas Frank's views about their fathers is down to the difference in what the men were like as fathers? Or is there something else about Nicholas that makes him more able to accept reality?
It's another excellent question. I've thought about this a lot. We did an event, those of you who've seen My Nazi Legacy, which is a film that you can get pretty easily on the usual sort of internet channels, will recall there was a moment, so we had a session in the Purcell Room, a very public event, where I interviewed the two men and explored their different perspectives and found myself, trying to be neutral in between the two of them. And that issue comes up. And Nicholas Frank expresses the view that I hated my father because he was a crap father. And Horst expresses the view that he loves his father or feels positively towards him because he was a decent father. It's plain that as family men, they had different dispositions, different ways of being, and that must have affected how the children were. On the other hand, both Nicholas and Horst have many siblings, and some of Horst's siblings, have a less positive view, I suspect, of their father, and some of Nicholas's siblings have a more positive view of their father. So that tends to disprove that theory. The other theory, of course, is that one is German and one is Austrian. And that, I think, also has been a subject that's come up quite a lot in the conversations. And I think it's fair to say, I hope I'm being fair to my Austrian friends, that Germany engaged much earlier and much more fully with what happened than Austria. Austria was hamstrung by the 1955 Treaty of Independence, in which Article 1 effectively says Austria was the first victim of Nazism. Well, we know that wasn't the case. We know if we look on the bench at the Nuremberg trial, the famous trial in 1945, there were a whole load of Austrians on the bench, defendants, including a man called Arthur Seyss-Inquart, who was the governor of the Netherlands. The book has come out simultaneously in Holland. And of course, there's much interest in Holland because of who Seyss-Inquart was. Well, Seyss-Inquart was Otto Vector's best friend. He was Austrian also, and he is Horst's godfather. And remarkably, Horst sleeps with a picture of Arthur Seyss-Inquart hanged at Nuremberg near his bed in his bedroom. So there are all manner of complexities. Horst will simply say to me, well, he was my godfather, and so I have to respect him in a certain way. So again, that's troubling and leaves you feeling a little uncomfortable, but each person deals with their past in their own way, I suppose.
And someone's asked a kind of flip side question, which is, how do you think your grandfather would have felt about your books and your research?
Well, every question is so excellent. That's a very complex question. I think about my grandfather a lot. I was already very close to my grandfather. He was a remarkable person, a very dignified man, a very humble man, a very impecunious man. He, lived a very humble life. And I ask myself a lot, or I express to myself a lot the sadness I feel that I never had a chance to ask him the questions that I explore in both these books. Of course, one of the questions I would have loved to ask him, and I feel almost a sense of shame that I never did ask him, but the reason I didn't ask him was that I knew he didn't want to talk about that period. But I never asked him the very simple question, what was your mother like? And I can't bear sometimes that I didn't ever have a conversation with him about his mother. And in a sense, I think I've written these books in part to memorialize these characters, my great-grandmothers, that I never knew. I think he would at the same time be horrified by aspects of these books. He would not like the glare of publicity. And then there would be another part of him that would feel a grandfatherly sense of pride that the work has been done to a suitable quality that he would admire, I hope. But of course, my career, in a sense, as I described in East West Street, is started by him. One of the very first gifts that he gave me when I was 21 years old was an Anglo-French legal dictionary. And that got me on my path to becoming an international lawyer. I think all of these things comes back to what I said earlier. The personal and the professional are deeply, deeply interconnected. And of course, in my case, both law and writing, there is a reverence for words, and there is a reverence for the act of interpretation, and a recognition that the act of interpretation is a deeply personal matter. Every single person who reads a single text will interpret it differently, and it will have a different resonance and a different impact for them. And that's the wonder of human nature. It's the wonder of reading, and it's the wonder of language and words. It's why we love writing, and why we love reading, and why we love libraries.
We definitely love libraries. So I think we've probably got time for a couple more questions. One person's asked about what your research has told you about whether there's a kind of fascist psyche, and someone has similarly asked about whether what to what extent can you generalize from these characters and draw conclusions about the ways the Nazi state and support for it worked?
Yeah, again, really excellent questions. I mean, one of the questions I've asked myself a lot is, could I do terrible things in certain circumstances? And I suspect many of us, if we put our hands on our hearts, would say to ourselves, well, I can't completely exclude that in some circumstances I would do terrible things. And in fact, these are questions I've been asking myself a lot. Everyone who's watching this somewhere in London, the world, Britain, is in lockdown, no doubt. And one of the things that's amazed me with this lockdown over the last 5 or 6 weeks, who would have imagined that when the government tells you 6 weeks ago you're not allowed out of your house anymore, we'd all do it. We would all, comply. If you're over 70 and you suffer certain ailments, you've got an indefinite period of essentially being incarcerated in your own home. We are able to be led in a certain way. Now, in this case, it's a virus. And I should say a virus plays a very big part in the demise of Otto Vector, and there's a detective story there. But the language of viruses and germs is, of course, the language that comes up in Nazi Germany. In short, I don't think that Germans and Austrians have a monopoly on international crime. And I think that any community is capable, under certain circumstances, in doing terrible things. One of the things I give real credit for, particularly to Germany, is engaging with its past in ways that I think no other community has done. I've become acutely conscious as East West Street has been published in, I think, over 25 languages now. I've gone all over the world. It'll, I suspect, be the same with the Ratline in that wonderful way. Gone to many different places to talk about it. And when you're in India or when you're in parts of Africa talking about East West Street, you realize that I grew up in wonderful London, multicultural, incredible city, an incredible country that Britain is. And we never once at school talked about colonialism and slavery. I mean, it's sort of amazing. There was never any recognition of what Britain did around the world to other people. And, we've got to call a spade a spade. Britain and the British, my country, France and the French, my country, have done terrible things around the world, but they've never really engaged with them in the way that Germany has. So, in short, I think it is embedded in the human spirit to have the capacity to do good and to do evil. And the question is, how do we restrain those inner demons? And in that sense, those who are very attentive readers of East West Street, and even more so in relation to the Ratline, and I'm sure that's all people who are on this call, will have noticed that there's a style that I've got in dealing with Otto Vector, which is about lines that he crosses. He crosses a very big line early on. He's 20 years old. He participates in an anti-Semitic rally, and he attacks Jews, and he is arrested and sentenced and imprisoned. And that's it. He's crossed the line. 10 years later, he crosses another line. And 10 years after that, he crosses another line. And I think what I've learned from the material is that it resides in each of us to understand that if we reach a crossroads and we take the wrong direction and we cross a line, there is no coming back. And once there is no coming back and you reach another point, you say to yourself, well, I did it once and the roof didn't collapse, the world didn't cave in, I can do it again, I can push it a little bit further. And one thing always leads to another. I think we have to be very careful, and I think we're living in a very dangerous moment right now. And coming back to COVID-19 and coronavirus, I mean, we can see different scenarios. We can see one scenario which is a move towards greater cooperation, premised on the idea, which I believe we're all in this together, we have to help ourselves. We have to help each other. We have to help. In helping ourselves, we help each other. The other view is, no, we become nationalistic, even more nationalistic. The barriers come down, the walls are erected, the barriers are created, and it's each country to itself. And I worry that coupled with what we're being told is going to be the greatest recession since the Great Depression, is capable of leading us to a very dark place. And I hope that we will learn from the lessons of history and avoid those actions and those disasters, because it is capable of happening again, and around the world in different places it is happening again in different ways, but very nastily.
On that note,
no, I want to end on a positive note. I want to end on
a positive note is that this situation is making us all very au fait with technology. And online events. I think you're going to be doing lots of online events that we haven't managed to cover all the questions. Let me see if there's a nice positive questions to answer on. I mean, there's a very straightforward one, which is, how long did it take to research the book?
How long did it take to research the book? Well, I mean, I really started in 2010 when I went to Lviv for the first time. Then in 2015, Horst gives me the materials, and of course, you know, you receive 10,000 pages. What do you do with it? Nothing. It's all in German. It's all in handwriting that's illegible. It just sits there. I look at the photographs from time to time because I can deal with those. They're simple enough. And then the great late Lisa Jardine comes for dinner one evening, and she says, "What are you working on?" And I say, "Well, I've got this USB with 10,000 pages of material." And she says, "Oh, that's interesting. Let's have a conversation about that." And that's what catalyzes it. So if we want to end on a positive note, let's recall extraordinary Lisa Jardine, historian. She wrote, and this is a good point to end because it brings us full circle back to your first question on the London Library. She was my colleague at University College London, history professor, and she gave an incredible inaugural lecture, to which she gave the title Temptation in the Archives, which is about how when you open the door, you can never let go. And that's what's happened to her. It's what's happened to me. I think it's probably what's happened to a lot of people in the audience. It's the joy of old material and documents and ideas and contradictions and words and sentences and commas and semicolons and following where they lead to. That is a joyous act, and it's an act that brings us together as a community, because as writer and reader we are engaged in a common endeavor and in a common effort, if you like, and we are joined, and that, I think, is the positive way. It's the greatness of the human spirit that we can actually commit to writing our experiences. Bless Charlotte Wächter, she didn't have to write down all her reminiscences and all the terrible things she got up to, but she did. And I'm sorry to say, in a certain sense, what a joy to be able to read and interpret and review that material. And what a joy to be able to talk with this audience and get these excellent questions.
And which couldn't possibly, thank you so much. And you couldn't possibly have summed up the glory of the London Library better, which is that you can borrow the books, you can browse the books, and it is a labyrinth of a million books to explore. Thank you. Please, everybody, go and buy this incredible book. There'll be a link coming up where you can buy it from Daunt's just after this. Thank you also to Jewish Book Week and to all my wonderful colleagues who braved the minefield of technology to some success and some less success. And a link to watch this event again or to share with others if you would like to do that. And we have a couple of other online events coming up, so please do register for those. Hopefully we'll be back in the autumn for some in real life events at the library.